The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention beside the flag-draped coffin. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but her heart was heavy with grief. Today, they were laying to rest Colonel Margaret Walsh, a woman who had been more than just Sarah's commanding officer. She had been her mentor, her champion, and the closest thing to a mother Sarah had known since joining the Army 15 years ago. Sarah was 35 years old, though people often assumed she was younger. At 5'3", with delicate features and a quiet demeanor, she didn't fit the picture many people had of a decorated combat veteran. She had learned long ago that her appearance could be both a blessing and a curse. Some underestimated her. Others dismissed her entirely. But Colonel Walsh had seen past all that from the very first day. The funeral procession was small but dignified. Colonel Walsh had never married, had no children of her own, but she had touched countless lives during her 40 years of service. Sarah looked at the faces gathered around the grave site. There were a dozen officers, some retired, some still serving, a handful of civilian friends, and then there was the old man. He stood apart from the others, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Sarah guessed he was in his 80s, maybe older. He wore an old suit that had seen better days, threadbare at the elbows, the pants a bit too short. His white hair was neatly combed, and despite his age and obvious frailty, he stood as straight as his crooked spine would allow. There was something military in his bearing, even now. Sarah had noticed him when he first arrived, shuffling slowly up the path to the grave site. She had wondered who he was, this elderly stranger who had come to pay his respects, but there had been no time to ask. The ceremony was about to begin. Lieutenant Marcus Crawford stood on the other side of the coffin. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of commanding presence that made people notice him. He had been assigned to assist with the funeral detail, and from the moment he arrived, he had made it clear that he was in charge. Sarah outranked him in time of service and combat experience, but Crawford had connections. His father was a congressman, his uncle a two-star general. He moved through the military with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Lieutenant Chen," Crawford had said when they first met that morning, his tone dismissive. "I'll handle the flag presentation. You just stand there and look respectful." Sarah had bitten back her response. This wasn't the time for a fight. This was about honoring Colonel Walsh, but Crawford's attitude stung. It always did. The chaplain began the service, his voice solemn and steady. Sarah listened to the familiar words, the prayers and blessings that she had heard at too many military funerals. Each one reminded her of the friends she had lost, the soldiers who had died under her command in Afghanistan, the brothers and sisters in arms who would never come home. Colonel Walsh had been different. She had died at 72, peacefully in her sleep, after a long and distinguished career. It was the kind of death every soldier hoped for, and yet Sarah felt cheated. She had wanted more time, more conversations over coffee, more advice about navigating a military that still, even now, didn't always know what to do with women who refused to stay in their assigned boxes. The rifle salute cracked through the morning air. 7 riflemen, 3 volleys each, 21 shots to honor a life of service. Sarah stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the coffin, willing herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of Crawford and the others who were already looking for reasons to call her weak. Then came the moment Sarah had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The flag folding ceremony. 2 soldiers lifted the American flag from the coffin and began the precise, ritualized folding. 13 folds, each one symbolic, each one performed with reverent care. Sarah watched, her throat tight with emotion. This was when the flag would be presented to the next of kin. But Colonel Walsh had no next of kin. She had specified in her will that the flag should go to Sarah. "She's the daughter I never had," the colonel had written. "She deserves to know how proud I am of her." Sarah had read those words a dozen times since the colonel's death, each time breaking down in tears. She had kept the letter in her uniform pocket, close to her heart. The flag was now a tight triangle of red, white, and blue. Crawford stepped forward to receive it from the folding detail. He held it against his chest, then turned toward the assembled mourners. His eyes swept across the small crowd, and for a moment Sarah thought he was looking for her. But then the old man stepped forward. He moved slowly, his cane tapping against the ground with each careful step. He approached Crawford with dignity, his weathered face solemn. When he reached the lieutenant, he stopped and stood as straight as he could, waiting. Crawford looked down at him, confusion flickering across his face. Then his expression hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," Crawford said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This flag is being presented to the designated recipient only." The old man didn't move. "I am here to receive the flag," he said quietly. His voice was thin with age but steady. "Margaret wanted me to have it." Sarah's breath caught. She had never heard the colonel mention this man. Who was he? Crawford's jaw tightened. "Sir, I have my orders. The flag goes to Lieutenant Chen. Now please step back before I have you removed." "Marcus," Sarah spoke for the first time, stepping forward, "maybe we should." "Stay out of this, Chen," Crawford snapped. "I'm handling it." The old man looked past Crawford to Sarah. Their eyes met and she saw something there. Pain, grief, and something else. Recognition, perhaps, as if he knew who she was even though they had never met. "Please," the old man said, turning back to Crawford. "Margaret and we had an understanding, she promised." "I don't care what she promised," Crawford interrupted. "You're not on the list, you're not family, you need to leave." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. This wasn't right. The ceremony was being disrupted, yes, but Crawford was handling it all wrong. This old man clearly had some connection to Colonel Walsh. He deserved respect at the very least. "Lieutenant Crawford," Sarah said more firmly, "perhaps we could." "Lieutenant Chen," I said, "stay out of it." Crawford's face was reddening now. He turned to two soldiers standing nearby. "Escort this gentleman away from the grave site, now." The old man's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked like he might collapse, but then he straightened again, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I served with her," he said, his voice breaking. "In Korea. She saved my life. I just wanted to say goodbye properly." Korea. Sarah's mind raced. Colonel Walsh had been in Korea. She had never mentioned it. But then, the colonel had been notoriously private about her early service years. The two soldiers approached the old man, clearly uncomfortable with their assignment. Before they could reach him, a voice rang out across the cemetery. "Attention!" Everyone froze. Sarah's head snapped toward the source of the command. A figure was striding up the path toward them, flanked by two aides. As he drew closer, Sarah's eyes widened. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. General James Mackenzie, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. Sarah had never met him personally, but she knew his reputation. He was a legend, a soldier's soldier, someone who had risen through the ranks on merit rather than connections. Everyone, including Crawford, snapped to attention. General Mackenzie approached the grave site with purposeful strides. He was in his late 60s, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He stopped in front of Crawford, who was still holding the folded flag. "Lieutenant," the general said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "What is happening here?" Crawford swallowed hard. "Sir, this civilian was attempting to interfere with the flag presentation ceremony. I was having him removed, sir." General Mackenzie's gaze shifted to the old man, who was standing as straight as he could manage, tears still running down his face. The general's expression softened immediately. "Henry," he said gently, "Henry Morrison, I should have known you'd be here." The old man nodded. "General Mackenzie, sir, I just wanted to pay my respects." The general turned back to Crawford. "Lieutenant, Do you know who this man is? No, sir. Crawford admitted. He's not on the list of. This is Sergeant Major Henry Morrison, retired, the general said. One of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege of serving with. He and Colonel Walsh served together in Korea and later in Vietnam. They saved each other's lives more times than either of them could count. Sarah felt her heart sink. Crawford had been about to have a hero forcibly removed from a funeral. The implications were staggering. "Sir, I didn't know," Crawford stammered. "He didn't identify himself and he's not on the list," General Mackenzie said, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "is not the final word on who matters and who doesn't, Lieutenant." He held out his hand to Crawford. "Give me the flag." Crawford handed it over immediately, his face pale. General Mackenzie held the flag for a moment, looking down at it with obvious emotion. Then he turned to Sarah. "Lieutenant Chen, Colonel Walsh spoke of you often. She was very proud of you." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed to say, though her voice was shaking. The general looked between Sarah and Henry Morrison. Then he made a decision. Colonel Walsh was a remarkable woman. She touched many lives. Both of you were important to her. He held out the flag to Henry. "Sergeant Major Morrison, on behalf of a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's service." Henry's hands trembled as he took the flag. He clutched it to his chest, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "Thank you." General Mackenzie placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, then turned to Sarah. "Lieutenant Chen, I'd like to speak with you after the ceremony. And Lieutenant Crawford, you and I will be having a conversation as well." The tone of his voice when he spoke to Crawford made it clear that conversation would not be pleasant. The general stepped back and the ceremony concluded, but Sarah barely heard the final prayers. Her mind was reeling with questions. Who was Henry Morrison really? What had he and Colonel Walsh been to each other? And why had the colonel never mentioned him? As the mourners began to disperse, Sarah watched Henry Morrison shuffle slowly away, the flag held carefully in his arms. General Mackenzie stopped him, speaking quietly to him for a few moments. Then the general turned and walked toward Sarah. "Lieutenant," he said, "I know you must have questions, and I think I have some answers. Can you join me for coffee?" Sarah glanced at Crawford, who was standing rigid, clearly dreading his own meeting with the general. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "I'd be honored." As she walked away from the grave site, leaving Colonel Walsh to her eternal rest, Sarah had no idea that everything she thought she knew about her mentor was about to change. The truth was far more complex and far more beautiful than she could have imagined. The coffee shop was a quiet place just outside the cemetery gates, a small establishment that had served military families for decades. General Mackenzie had chosen a corner booth, away from the few other customers. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't yet tasted. Henry Morrison sat beside the general, the folded flag resting on the seat next to him. He hadn't let it out of his sight. Sarah studied the old man more carefully now. Up close, she could see the tremor in his hands, the way his breathing was labored. But she also saw the intelligence in his eyes, the quiet strength that age hadn't diminished. This was a man who had seen things, done things, survived things that most people couldn't imagine. "I suppose I owe you both an explanation," General Mackenzie began. He took a sip of his coffee and leaned back in the booth. "Henry, how much did Margaret tell you about Lieutenant Chen?" "Everything," Henry said softly. "She wrote to me about her, called her the daughter she never had, said Sarah reminded her of herself when she was young." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "She wrote to you. I didn't know the colonel corresponded with anyone from her early service days." Henry smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "Margaret and I wrote letters for 60 years, every month without fail, even when we were both serving in different parts of the world, even when we came home and built separate lives. We never stopped writing." I met them both in Vietnam, General Mackenzie said. I was a young captain then, green as grass and scared out of my mind. Margaret was already a legend. She was one of the first women to serve in a combat zone in an official capacity, and Henry was her sergeant, her right hand, the man who kept her alive. Sarah tried to reconcile this information with what she knew of Colonel Walsh. The colonel had rarely spoken about Vietnam. When she did, it was in general terms, never specifics. Sarah had assumed it was too painful, too traumatic. Now she was beginning to understand there might have been other reasons for the colonel's silence. We met in Korea, Henry said, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone lost in memory. I was 19 years old, stupid and full of myself. Thought I knew everything about being a soldier. Then I got separated from my unit during a Chinese offensive. I was wounded, bleeding out in a ditch, certain I was going to die. He paused, his hands tightening on his coffee cup. Margaret found me. She was a nurse then, attached to a MASH unit. But she was out there on the front lines, doing what she always did, going where she was needed most. She dragged me back to safety under heavy fire, took a bullet in her shoulder doing it. Sarah's eyes widened. The colonel had a scar on her shoulder. I asked her about it once, and she said it was from a training accident. Henry shook his head. Margaret never liked to talk about her heroism. She did what needed to be done, then moved on. That was her way. After Korea, they both stayed in the Army, General Mackenzie continued. Henry went to Ranger School, became one of the best NCOs in the service. Margaret went to Officer Candidate School. By the time Vietnam came around, they were both battle-hardened veterans. They requested assignments together, and the Army, in its wisdom, granted the request. We were a good team, Henry said. I knew how she thought, she knew how I operated. We saved each other's lives a dozen times over, and we became— He trailed off, his voice catching. You became more than friends, Sarah said gently. Henry nodded. We fell in love. Out there in the jungle, surrounded by death and violence, we found something beautiful, something that made all of it bearable. Sarah felt her heart aching for them. Why didn't you marry? Why didn't you stay together? Henry's face clouded with old pain. We wanted to. God, how we wanted to. But the Army had regulations. Officers and enlisted personnel couldn't fraternize. It didn't matter that we'd served together for years, that we'd earned our ranks separately. The rules were the rules. So you made a choice, General Mackenzie said quietly. Tell her, Henry. The old man took a shaky breath. Margaret was being groomed for greatness. Everyone could see it. She was smart, brave, a natural leader. She was going to break barriers, open doors for women who came after her. But if they found out about us, about our relationship, it would have ended both our careers. Hers especially. The military wasn't ready for it, Sarah said, understanding dawning. A female officer in a relationship with an enlisted man, they would have crucified her. Worse, Henry said. They would have quietly pushed her out, destroyed her reputation, made sure she never got another command. All the women who might have followed in her footsteps would have been set back years. We couldn't let that happen. So you ended it, Sarah said softly. We ended the romance, Henry corrected. But we never ended our love. We stayed friends. We stayed in each other's lives as much as we could. We just did it quietly. General Mackenzie leaned forward. I knew them both for 30 years. I watched them sacrifice their happiness for the greater good. I watched Margaret rise through the ranks, become a colonel, mentor hundreds of young officers. And I watched Henry build his own distinguished career, retire as a sergeant major, one of the most respected NCOs in the Army. And through it all, we wrote letters, Henry said. Every month, sometimes more. We told each other everything, our fears, our triumphs, our regrets. Margaret told me about you, Lieutenant Chen. She told me how proud she was of you, how you reminded her of her younger self. Sarah wiped at her eyes, not caring any more about maintaining her composure. I wish I had known. I wish she had told me about you. She wanted to, Henry said. In her last letter, she said she was going to introduce us. She said it was time to stop hiding, that she was too old to care what anyone thought anymore. But then, he couldn't finish the sentence. She died before she could, Sarah finished for him. And today you came to her funeral, hopping to pay your respects, and you were nearly thrown out. Henry nodded. I didn't handle it well. I should have identified myself properly. But I was so overwhelmed with grief. When I saw her coffin, when I realized she was really gone, I just wanted to hold that flag, one last piece of her to carry with me. General Mackenzie's expression hardened. Lieutenant Crawford's behavior was inexcusable. He should have treated you with respect regardless of who you were. But to disrespect a sergeant major, a veteran, a man who served his country with distinction. He shook his head. Crawford will be answering for that. He didn't know, Sarah found herself saying, though she wasn't sure why she was defending Crawford. Maybe because she understood what it was like to make mistakes, to let protocol blind you to humanity. Ignorance is not an excuse, the general said firmly. Crawford's problem isn't just that he didn't know who Henry was. His problem is that he didn't care. He saw an old man in a worn-out suit and made assumptions. That kind of thinking has no place in our military. Sarah thought about how Crawford had dismissed her too, how he had talked over her, brushed aside her concerns. It was the same kind of thinking, just directed at different targets. Judge by appearances. Assume weakness. Dismiss without consideration. Margaret faced that her whole career, Henry said, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. People underestimating her because she was a woman. People assuming she couldn't lead, couldn't fight, couldn't make the hard decisions. She proved them all wrong. She did, Sarah agreed. She was the strongest person I ever knew. She thought the same of you, Henry said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope. This is the last letter she wrote to me. She sent it a week before she died, I think. I think you should read it. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. The handwriting on the front was Colonel Walsh's, neat and precise even in her final days. Sarah carefully pulled out the letter and began to read. Dearest Henry, I'm writing to you from my hospital bed, though the doctors assure me it's just a precaution. My heart isn't what it used to be, but then none of me is. I'm 72 years old and I've lived a full life. If this is the end, I can't complain. But there's something I need to tell you, something I've been thinking about more and more lately. I have regrets, Henry. Not about my career, not about my service. I'm proud of what I accomplished. But I regret the choices we made all those years ago. We sacrificed our happiness for the good of the service, for the women who would come after me. And I still believe that was necessary. The military wasn't ready for us, not then. But Henry, I wonder if we waited too long. I wonder if we let fear and duty keep us apart even after it mattered. You retired 20 years ago. I could have retired then too. We could have had 20 years together, Henry. 20 years of the life we always dreamed of. But I stayed in. I kept climbing, kept pushing, kept trying to prove something that didn't need proving anymore. I'm telling you this because I don't want Lieutenant Sarah Chen to make the same mistakes. She's so much like I was at her age. Brave, determined, willing to sacrifice everything for the service. But I don't want her to sacrifice too much. I don't want her to wake up at 72 and realize she gave up her chance at happiness for a cause that no longer needed her sacrifice. I'm going to introduce you to when I get out of this hospital. I want her to hear our story. I want her to understand that duty is important, service is important, but so is living. So is love. So is allowing yourself to be happy. If something happens to me before I can make that introduction, please find her. Tell her our story. Tell her that I loved her like a daughter. Tell her that she doesn't have to be as strong as she thinks she does. Tell her it's okay to be human. I love you, Henry. I always have. I always will. And if there's anything after this life, I hope we'll finally get to be together without rules or regulations standing in our way. All my love. Margaret. Sarah finished reading with tears streaming down her face. She carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Henry, who tucked it away with reverent care. She loved you very much, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. And I loved her, Henry replied, every day of my life. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Then General Mackenzie spoke. Lieutenant Chen, I'm going to tell you something that Margaret told me years ago. She said the hardest part of being a trailblazer is knowing that your sacrifices won't benefit you. They benefit the people who come after. You clear the path, and others walk it freely. Sarah nodded, understanding. She cleared the path for me, for all of us. She did, the general agreed. But here's what I want you to understand. The path is clear now. Not completely, not perfectly. There are still battles to fight, still barriers to break. But women like you don't have to make the same sacrifices Margaret made. You don't have to give up everything personal to prove you're professional. Crawford doesn't see it that way, Sarah said bitterly. People like him, they still see women in uniform as outsiders, as less than. Crawford is a dinosaur, General Mackenzie said bluntly, and his kind is dying out. Not fast enough, perhaps, but dying nonetheless. The military is changing, Chen, slowly but surely. Henry reached across the table and placed his weathered hand over Sarah's. Don't let the Crawfords of the world make you hard, Lieutenant. Don't let them make you into someone who can't feel, can't love, can't live. Margaret's one regret was that she let the fight consume her. Don't make the same mistake. Sarah looked at this old man, this veteran who had loved her mentor for 60 years and never given up hope. She thought about Colonel Walsh's letter, about the regrets of a life spent always putting duty first. I don't know how to do that, Sarah admitted. I don't know how to be softer and still be taken seriously. I don't know how to show vulnerability and still be respected. You don't have to have all the answers, General Mackenzie said. You just have to be willing to try, to be human, to let people in. Sarah thought about her own life. She was 35 years old, divorced from a marriage that had fallen apart because she couldn't balance her career and her personal life. She had no children, few close friends, an apartment that felt more like a barracks than a home. She had followed Colonel Walsh's example in so many ways. Had she also inherited her regrets? What happened to you and the Colonel? Sarah said to Henry. That couldn't happen today, could it? The regulations about fraternization, they've changed. They have, General Mackenzie confirmed. Officers and enlisted personnel still can't be in relationships while serving in the same chain of command, but the blanket prohibition is gone. The military has evolved. So Margaret and I, if we were young today, Henry trailed off, his eyes distant with possibility. You could have had your careers and each other, Sarah finished. You wouldn't have had to choose. Progress, General Mackenzie said. Hard one, slow to come, but progress nonetheless. Margaret helped make that possible. Her service, her sacrifice, they mattered. Sarah felt something shift inside her. A weight she had been carrying for years, the weight of always having to be perfect, always having to be stronger than everyone else, began to lift slightly. Maybe she didn't have to carry it alone. Maybe it was okay to ask for help, to show weakness, to be human. Thank you, she said to both men. Thank you for telling me this, for trusting me with your story. It's your story too now, Henry said. You were Margaret's legacy. She saw so much of herself in you, but she also saw your potential to be more, to be better, to learn from her mistakes and make different choices. General Mackenzie checked his watch and sighed. I'm afraid I have an unpleasant duty to attend to. Lieutenant Crawford and I have a meeting scheduled. He stood, and both Sarah and Henry rose as well. Lieutenant Chen, I'd like you to join us. I think it would be educational for Crawford to hear about the people he tried to have removed from the funeral. Sarah's stomach tightened. She didn't relish the idea of seeing Crawford disciplined, even if he deserved it, but she understood the general's reasoning. Crawford needed to learn. needed to understand the consequences of his actions and attitudes. "Yes, sir," she said. Henry placed the folded flag carefully in a bag he'd brought. "I should be going. I have a long drive home." "Where is home?" Sarah asked. "A small town in West Virginia," Henry said. "Nothing fancy, just a quiet place where an old man can live out his days." Sarah made a decision in that moment. "Would you mind if I visited sometime? I'd like to hear more stories about the Colonel, about who she was before I knew her." Henry's face lit up with a smile that took years off his appearance. "I would like that very much, Lieutenant, very much indeed." They exchanged contact information, and Sarah walked Henry out to his car, an old sedan that had seen better days. She helped him get settled in the driver's seat, making sure he was comfortable. "Drive safely," she said. "I will," Henry promised. He looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Margaret was right about you, you know. You are special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sarah watched him drive away, then returned to the coffee shop where General Mackenzie was waiting. Together, they walked back toward the cemetery grounds where Crawford had been told to wait. The confrontation that was coming would not be pleasant, but it was necessary. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had allies. People who understood not just the weight of the uniform, but the weight of being human while wearing it. Colonel Walsh's funeral had not gone as planned, but perhaps, Sarah thought, it had gone exactly as it needed to. Lieutenant Marcus Crawford sat alone in a small office building adjacent to the cemetery, his leg bouncing nervously as he waited. He had been ordered to remain there after the funeral, told that General Mackenzie would meet with him shortly. That had been 45 minutes ago. The waiting was almost worse than whatever was coming. Crawford knew he had made a mistake. The moment he saw the 4 stars on General Mackenzie's shoulders, the moment he heard the general call that old man, Sergeant Major Morrison, Crawford had felt his stomach drop. But even now, sitting alone with his thoughts, he couldn't quite understand what he'd done that was so wrong. He had been following protocol. The flag presentation list didn't include Henry Morrison. The old man had no official standing. Crawford had been doing his job, maintaining order at a military funeral. Wasn't that what he was supposed to do? The door opened, and General Mackenzie entered, followed by Lieutenant Chen. Crawford jumped to his feet and saluted smartly. "At ease, Lieutenant," the general said, his voice neutral. He took a seat behind the desk while Lieutenant Chen stood off to the side. "Sit down." Crawford sat, trying to keep his expression neutral. He noticed Chen wouldn't meet his eyes. Good, he thought. She should be embarrassed. She had tried to undermine him during the ceremony, questioning his authority. "Lieutenant Crawford," General Mackenzie began, folding his hands on the desk, "do you understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir," Crawford said. "I made an error in judgment regarding the civilian at the funeral, sir." "An error in judgment," the general repeated. "Is that how you characterize what happened?" Crawford hesitated. "Sir, I was attempting to maintain the dignity and order of the ceremony. The individual in question was not on the approved list for flag presentation, and when he insisted on interfering, I took appropriate action to remove him." "You took appropriate action," the general said slowly. "Let me tell you what I saw, Lieutenant. I saw you dismiss a decorated veteran, a man who served his country for 30 years, without even asking who he was or why he was there. I saw you speak to him with disrespect and condescension. I saw you prepare to have him physically removed from the funeral of a woman he loved." "Sir, I didn't know who he was," Crawford protested. "He didn't identify himself as—" "Why should he have to?" The general's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Why should any elderly veteran have to prove his worth to you before being treated with basic respect?" Crawford opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no good answer to that. "And it wasn't just Sergeant Major Morrison," the general continued. "Lieutenant Chen attempted to intervene, tried to suggest a more compassionate approach, and you dismissed her as well. Tell me, Lieutenant, why did you feel the need to silence a fellow officer? Crawford glanced at Sarah, who was still standing quietly to the side. Sir, Lieutenant Chen was not in command of the ceremony. I was. I needed to maintain authority. Authority, General Mackenzie said. Let me ask you something, Crawford. What do you know about Lieutenant Chen's service record? Sir, Crawford faltered. I know she's been in the service for 15 years. 15 years, the general confirmed. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 with Valor Device. She led a platoon that held a forward operating base against a Taliban assault for 18 hours until reinforcements arrived. She was wounded twice, returned to duty both times. She has more combat experience than most officers twice her age. Crawford felt heat rising in his cheeks. He had assumed Chen was just another paper pusher, someone who had gotten by on quotas and lowered standards. He had never bothered to look at her service record. And yet, the general continued, you spoke to her like she was a nuisance, like her input had no value. Why is that, Lieutenant? Sir, I was focused on the ceremony, Crawford said weakly. No, the general said flatly. You were focused on your own authority, your own importance. You saw someone who didn't fit your image of what a soldier should be, and you dismissed her, just like you dismissed Sergeant Major Morrison. Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Sir, if I may, I don't think Lieutenant Crawford is a bad officer. I think he's a product of his environment. He's been taught that leadership means never showing uncertainty, never asking for input, never appearing weak. Crawford looked at her in surprise. Was she defending him? That may be true, General Mackenzie said, but it's not an excuse. Leadership isn't about projecting strength and silencing dissent. It's about listening, learning, having the humility to admit when you don't know something. He turned his attention back to Crawford. Let me tell you about Colonel Margaret Walsh, Lieutenant. She was one of the finest officers I ever served with. Do you know why? Not because she was the strongest or the loudest or the most domineering, but because she listened. She valued every soldier under her command, from the newest private to the most senior sergeant. She understood that rank doesn't equal wisdom, and that sometimes the best ideas come from unexpected sources. Crawford said nothing. He was beginning to understand the depth of his failure. Sergeant Major Morrison and Colonel Walsh served together for years, the general continued. They saved each other's lives multiple times. They loved each other, but they gave up that love because the military regulations at the time didn't allow their relationship. They sacrificed their personal happiness for their careers, for the good of the service. Crawford felt something twist in his gut. He had been prepared to have this man physically removed from the funeral of his lost love. Morrison came to that funeral to say goodbye to the most important person in his life, General Mackenzie said. And you, Lieutenant, treated him like he was trash, like he didn't matter. Sir, I'm sorry, Crawford said, and he meant it. I truly didn't know. Again, Lieutenant, why should you have had to know? Why couldn't you have simply treated him with the respect that any elderly person deserves? Why couldn't you have asked questions before making assumptions? Crawford had no answer. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and damning. Sir, Sarah said, stepping forward, may I speak with Lieutenant Crawford privately for a moment? General Mackenzie studied her for a long moment, then nodded. 5 minutes, Lieutenant Chen. Then Crawford and I have more to discuss. The general left the room, closing the door behind him. Crawford and Sarah stood alone, the tension between them palpable. Why did you defend me? Crawford asked. I was dismissive to you, rude. Because I've been in your position, Sarah said. She moved to sit in the chair the general had vacated, gesturing for Crawford to remain seated across from her. Not exactly the same situation, but similar. When I first became an officer, I thought I had to be harder than everyone else, tougher, more rigid. I thought if I showed any softness, any uncertainty, people would see me as weak. Crawford listened, surprised by her candor. I made mistakes, Sarah continued. I dismissed good advice because I thought accepting help made me look incompetent. I pushed away people who were trying to support me because I thought I had to do everything alone. It took me years to learn that real strength isn't about refusing to bend. It's about knowing when to listen. Colonel Walsh taught you that, Crawford said. She did, and she paid a high price to learn it herself. Sarah leaned forward. Marcus, may I call you Marcus? He nodded. Marcus, you're a good officer. You're organized, you're dedicated, you follow protocol. But protocol isn't everything. Sometimes the most important thing is simply being human, seeing people as people, not just as entries on a list. Crawford felt his eyes burning. He blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of her. I was raised to believe that emotion is weakness, that the only way to lead is to be hard, unbending. Your father is a congressman, Sarah said gently. Your uncle is a general. You've grown up in a world where image is everything, where showing vulnerability is seen as failure. How do you know that? Crawford asked. I looked up your record after we were assigned to work together, Sarah admitted. I wanted to understand who you were, just like you should have looked up mine. Crawford nodded slowly. You're right, I made assumptions. About you, about Sergeant Major Morrison, about what matters in the service. We all make assumptions, Sarah said. The question is whether we're willing to learn from our mistakes. The door opened, and General Mackenzie returned. He looked between the two lieutenants, nodding the change in atmosphere. Lieutenant Chen, thank you, he said. Crawford, you and I still have matters to discuss. Sarah stood and headed for the door. As she passed Crawford, she paused and placed a hand on his shoulder. Learn from this, Marcus. Be better. Then she was gone, and Crawford was alone with the general again. Lieutenant Crawford, General Mackenzie said, resuming his seat. I'm going to be blunt with you. Your behavior today was unacceptable. You disrespected a veteran, dismissed a fellow officer, and allowed your own ego to override your judgment. Yes, sir, Crawford said quietly. However, the general continued, I'm not going to end your career over this. Do you know why? Crawford shook his head. Because I see potential in you. Raw potential that's been poorly shaped by an environment that values the wrong things. You can either continue down the path you're on, becoming the kind of officer who leads through intimidation and rigid adherence to rules, or you can choose to be different, to be better. How do I do that, sir? Crawford asked. By learning to listen, by questioning your assumptions, by understanding that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you're wrong. The general pulled out a folder from his briefcase. I'm assigning you to a new unit. You'll be working under Colonel Richard Stone. He's one of the best officers in the Army when it comes to developing young leaders. Crawford's heart sank. A reassignment was essentially a demotion, a public acknowledgement of his failure. Sir, this isn't a punishment, Crawford. It's an opportunity. Colonel Stone specializes in teaching officers how to lead with both strength and compassion. You'll learn things that your father and uncle never taught you, things that will make you a better officer and a better man. Crawford nodded slowly. Yes, sir, thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, the general said with a slight smile. Stone is a tough teacher. He'll challenge everything you think you know about leadership. But if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to change, you'll come out of his command as the kind of officer this army needs. I'll do my best, sir. See that you do. General Mackenzie stood, signaling the meeting was over. You're dismissed, Lieutenant. Report to Colonel Stone's office at 800 tomorrow. Crawford saluted and left the office. Outside, he found Sarah Chen waiting in the hallway. I wanted to make sure you were okay, she said. Crawford was taken aback by her concern. I'm being reassigned to Colonel Stone. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. That's actually good. Stone is tough, but he's fair. He'll teach you a lot. You know him. He was one of Colonel Walsh's closest friends. She spoke highly of him. Sarah studied Crawford carefully. This is a second chance, Marcus. Don't waste it. I won't, Crawford promised. He hesitated, then said, I owe you an apology for how I treated you today, for dismissing you. You tried to help and I was too arrogant to listen. Apology accepted, Sarah said simply. We all have room to grow. The question is whether we're willing to do the work. They stood in silence for a moment, two officers who had started the day as adversaries and were ending it as something different. Not quite friends, perhaps, but allies in the ongoing struggle to be better. Can I ask you something? Crawford said. Why did you speak up for me with the general? You could have let him throw the book at me. Sarah smiled slightly. Because Colonel Walsh taught me that we're all on the same side. We all wear the same uniform. And if we don't support each other, if we don't help each other grow and learn, then we're failing the service just as much as if we failed in combat. Crawford nodded, understanding. Thank you, Lieutenant Chen. Call me Sarah, she said, and you're welcome, Marcus. As Crawford walked away, heading to his car and the uncertain future that awaited him, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel after this disastrous day. He felt hope. Hope that he could change, could learn, could become the kind of officer who honored the service rather than just himself. Behind him, Sarah Chen watched him go, thinking about Colonel Walsh and Sergeant Major Morrison, about sacrifices made and lessons learned. The path forward wasn't always clear, but at least now they were walking it together. 3 months later, Sarah Chen sat in a small diner in a town in West Virginia she had never heard of until recently. Across from her, Henry Morrison was working his way through a stack of pancakes, pausing occasionally to share another story about his years of service with Colonel Margaret Walsh. So there we were, Henry said, his eyes bright with the memory. Stuck in a foxhole during a monsoon, water up to our knees, and Margaret looks at me and says, Henry, after this is over, I'm going to find the person who invented camping and give them a piece of my mind. Sarah laughed, trying to imagine her stern, composed mentor making jokes in the middle of a combat zone. But these visits with Henry had shown her a side of Colonel Walsh she had never known. The woman behind the uniform, the person beneath the rank. This was Sarah's fourth visit to Henry's home in the past 3 months. After the funeral, they had stayed in contact, and Sarah had made it a point to drive out to see him whenever she had a free weekend. She told herself it was about learning more about the colonel, about understanding her mentor's history. But truthfully, it was more than that. Henry had become a friend, a connection to a past that felt increasingly important. How are you feeling? Sarah asked, nodding that Henry looked a bit thinner than he had at the funeral. Oh, you know, Henry said with a shrug. Old age isn't for the weak, but I'm still here, still kicking. Can't complain. Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. It's Marcus. He wants to know if I'm free for lunch next week. Crawford, Henry raised an eyebrow. The lieutenant from the funeral. The same, Sarah confirmed. He's changed a lot in the past few months. Colonel Stone has been good for him. Sarah had been surprised when Crawford had reached out to her a few weeks after the funeral. He had asked if they could meet for coffee, and she had agreed, curious. That first meeting had been awkward, with Crawford clearly uncomfortable and uncertain. But he had been sincere in his desire to learn, to change, to be better. They had started meeting regularly, and Sarah had found herself becoming something like a mentor to him. She shared the lessons Colonel Walsh had taught her, the hard-won wisdom about leadership and service. Crawford listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. People can surprise you, Henry said thoughtfully. I've seen men who seemed beyond redemption turn their lives around. I've also seen good people make one mistake and let it define them forever. The difference is whether they're willing to do the work. Crawford is doing the work, Sarah said. He's not the same person who tried to have you removed from the funeral. Good, Henry said. Margaret would be pleased. She always believed in second chances. They finished their breakfast, and Henry insisted on paying despite Sarah's protests. Then they drove to the cemetery where Margaret Walsh's parents were buried. Henry visited every week, bringing flowers and spending time talking to them about their daughter. "I never met them," Henry said as they stood before the graves. "Margaret's parents, I mean. They died before we could be together openly, but I like to think they would have approved of us." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sure they would have, Henry." They stood in comfortable silence, the autumn wind rustling through the trees around them. It was peaceful here, a small cemetery in a small town, far from the grand monuments of Arlington. "You know," Henry said after a while, "Margaret's will specified that she wanted to be buried at Arlington, among other soldiers. But she also left instructions for a small memorial here, near her parents. I'm working on getting permission for that." "I'd like to help with that," Sarah said, "however I can." "I'd appreciate that," Henry said with a warm smile. They spent another hour at the cemetery, with Henry sharing more stories about Margaret's childhood in this town, about the girl who had dreamed of adventure and found it in military service. Then they returned to Henry's small house, where Sarah helped him sort through boxes of old letters and photographs. "I'm thinking of donating these to the Army Archives," Henry said, holding up a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "Margaret's correspondence, our story. It should be preserved. Future soldiers should know about the sacrifices that were made." Sarah carefully untied the ribbon and began reading through the letters. They spanned decades, from the Korean War to just weeks before Margaret's death. They were intimate, honest, filled with love and longing and hope. They were also heartbreaking, a chronicle of two people who had wanted nothing more than to be together but had chosen duty over desire. "These are incredible, Henry," Sarah said. "They're a piece of history." "They're a piece of our history," Henry corrected. "Mine and Margaret's, but I suppose they belong to everyone now." Sarah's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her eyes widened. "It's General Mackenzie. Do you mind if I take this?" "Go ahead," Henry said, waving her toward the other room. Sarah answered the call. "General Mackenzie, sir, this is a surprise." "Lieutenant Chen," the general's voice came through clearly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all, sir. I'm visiting Sergeant Major Morrison, actually." "Excellent. Please give him my regards. I'm calling because I have some news that concerns both of you. Is this a good time to talk?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said, her curiosity piqued. "The Army has decided to posthumously award Colonel Walsh the Distinguished Service Cross," the general said, "for actions during the Vietnam War that were recently brought to light through declassified documents. It appears that Margaret saved an entire company from an ambush, providing covering fire while wounded and calling in air support that turned the tide of the engagement." Sarah's breath caught. The Distinguished Service Cross was the second highest military decoration, just below the Medal of Honor. "Sir, that's incredible. Why wasn't she recognized at the time?" "The records were classified for decades. The engagement involved operations that weren't publicly acknowledged. But now that the documents have been declassified, the Army is moving forward with the recognition she deserved." The general paused. "There will be a ceremony at the Pentagon in 2 months. Sergeant Major Morrison will be presented with the medal as Margaret's designated representative. And I'd like you to be there as well, Lieutenant Chen." "Of course, sir, I'd be honored." "There's more," the general said. "The Army is also establishing a scholarship fund in Colonel Walsh's name, focused on supporting women pursuing military careers. I'm going to be chairing the committee, and I'd like you to serve on it as well." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say, thank you." "Don't thank me. This is long overdue. Colonel Walsh's contributions to the Army were significant, and her legacy should be honored properly." The general's tone softened slightly. "How is Morrison doing? I've been meaning to visit, but my schedule has been difficult." "He's doing well, sir. He's strong, but he misses her." "We all do," the general said quietly. "Please tell him about the medal, and tell him that I'll be calling him directly about the ceremony details." After the call ended, Sarah returned to the living room where Henry was still sorting through old photographs. She told him about the Distinguished Service Cross, about the ceremony, about the scholarship fund. Henry listened with tears streaming down his weathered face. "She deserved this," he said when Sarah finished. "She deserved all of this and more." "She did," Sarah agreed. "And now the world will know what she did, who she was." Henry picked up one of the photographs, an image of a young Margaret Walsh in her Army nurse uniform, smiling at the camera. "She was so beautiful, so full of life and hope. I wish I could tell her about this, about the medal, about the scholarship, about how her story is finally being told." Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand. "I think she knows, Henry. Wherever she is, I think she knows." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the memories of a life well lived, and a love that had endured despite all obstacles. 2 months later, the Pentagon ceremony was everything Sarah had hoped it would be. The room was filled with senior officers, government officials, and journalists. Henry Morrison, dressed in his old Army uniform that had been carefully preserved, sat in the front row. Sarah sat beside him, wearing her dress uniform, her medals gleaming on her chest. General Mackenzie presided over the ceremony, reading the citation for Margaret Walsh's Distinguished Service Cross. He described her actions in detail, how she had recognized the ambush before it was sprung, how she had organized the defense despite being wounded, how she had held her position for hours until reinforcements arrived. 23 soldiers owed their lives to her quick thinking and bravery. When the medal was presented to Henry, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Henry stood as straight as his old back would allow, accepting the medal with trembling hands and barely contained emotion. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history. But Sarah noticed something else. In the back of the room, standing at attention, was Marcus Crawford. He had requested permission to attend the ceremony, wanting to pay his respects properly this time. When he caught Sarah's eye, he nodded slightly, a gesture of respect and understanding. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Sarah watched as person after person came up to Henry, thanking him for his service, expressing their admiration for Margaret Walsh. Henry handled it all with grace and humility, sharing stories about Margaret when asked, listening intently when others shared their own memories of her. Crawford approached Sarah, and they stood together watching the crowd. "She must have been an amazing person," Crawford said quietly. "She was," Sarah confirmed, "and she would have been proud to see this, to see the Army finally recognizing what she did." "I've been thinking a lot about that day at the funeral," Crawford said, "about how close I came to making an even bigger mistake than I did. If the general hadn't shown up, if you hadn't tried to intervene, I would have had Sergeant Major Morrison forcibly removed. I would have denied him the chance to say goodbye to the woman he loved." "But you didn't," Sarah said, "and you've learned from it. That's what matters." Crawford shook his head. "I should have known better from the start. I should have treated him with respect regardless of who he was." "You should have," Sarah agreed. "But we all make mistakes, Marcus. The question is what we do afterward." "Colonel Stone tells me the same thing," Crawford said with a slight smile. "He's been challenging, but in a good way. He makes me question my assumptions, makes me think about why I do things instead of just following protocol blindly." "That's good leadership," Sarah said, "teaching you to think for yourself." They were interrupted by General Mackenzie, who approached with a woman Sarah didn't recognize. "Lieutenant Chen, Lieutenant Crawford," the general said. "I'd like to introduce you to someone. This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Margaret's niece." Sarah's eyes widened. "I didn't know Colonel Walsh had family." "Distant family," Dr. Walsh said with a sad smile. We weren't close, unfortunately. I was living overseas during most of her later years. I only learned about her death after the funeral had already happened. But when I heard about this ceremony, I knew I had to be here. Your aunt was an incredible woman, Sarah said. She changed my life. She changed a lot of lives, Dr. Walsh said. I'm learning more about that now. I never really understood what she sacrificed for her career. The general has been telling me about her relationship with Sergeant Major Morrison. It's a beautiful story, Sarah said. Sad but beautiful. I'd like to meet him, Dr. Walsh said, if you think that would be appropriate. Sarah glanced across the room at Henry, who was currently speaking with a group of junior officers, no doubt sharing more stories about Margaret. I think he would like that very much. Sarah made the introduction and she watched as Henry and Dr. Walsh spoke, both of them emotional, both of them finding comfort in their shared connection to Margaret. It was healing, Sarah thought, for both of them. As the reception wound down, Sarah found herself standing alone on a balcony overlooking the Pentagon courtyard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about Colonel Walsh, about the sacrifices she had made, about the legacy she had left behind. "Beautiful evening," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find General Mackenzie joining her on the balcony. "Yes, sir," she agreed. Margaret would have hated all this fuss, the general said with a slight smile. She never liked being the center of attention. "But she deserved the recognition," Sarah said. "She did, and so do you, Lieutenant." The general turned to look at her directly. "I've been following your career. You're a fine officer. Margaret saw that in you, and she was right." "Thank you, sir." "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something," the general continued. "You don't have to follow Margaret's exact path. You don't have to make the same sacrifices she did. The military has changed, is still changing. You can have a career and a life. You can be strong and still be human." Sarah nodded, thinking about Henry's words, about Margaret's letter, about all the lessons she had learned over the past few months. "I'm trying to figure out how to do that, sir," she admitted. "It's not easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," the general said. "But you have people supporting you. Morris and me, even Crawford in his own way. We're all rooting for you, Lieutenant. Don't forget that." "I won't, sir." The general left her alone on the balcony, and Sarah stood there a while longer, watching the sun set over the Pentagon. She thought about her future, about the choices she would make, about the kind of officer and person she wanted to be. Inside, the reception was ending. Henry was saying his goodbyes, clutching the metal case to his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was, Sarah realized. It was a piece of Margaret, tangible proof of her bravery and sacrifice. Sarah rejoined Henry, and together they walked out of the Pentagon. Crawford fell into step beside them, having also stayed until the end. "Can I give you both a ride?" Crawford offered. "I drove here separately." "That would be kind of you," Henry said. "These old legs don't walk as well as they used to." As they drove through the Washington, D.C. traffic, the three of them talked. Henry shared more stories. Crawford asked questions, genuinely interested, genuinely trying to understand and learn. Sarah listened, adding her own memories of Colonel Walsh when appropriate. They dropped Henry off at his hotel first. He would be staying in Washington for a few more days, visiting some of the monuments and memorials. Dr. Walsh had offered to show him around, wanting to spend more time hearing about her aunt. "Thank you," Henry said as he prepared to exit the car. "Both of you, for being here today. Margaret would have been pleased to know that her legacy is in good hands." After Henry had gone inside, Crawford drove Sarah to her apartment. They sat in the car for a moment, neither quite ready to end the evening. "I've been thinking," Crawford said, "about what I want my legacy to be, about the kind of officer I want to become." "And," Sarah prompted. "I want to be someone who sees people," Crawford said. Not just ranks and protocols, but actual human beings with stories and value. I want to be the kind of leader who listens more than he talks, who learns from his mistakes, who makes the people under his command better, not just more obedient. Sarah smiled. That's a good goal, Marcus. I'm not there yet, he admitted. But I'm trying. Colonel Stone says I'm making progress. You are, Sarah confirmed. I've seen the change. Colonel Walsh would be proud. Crawford was quiet for a moment. Do you think Morrison will be okay? He seemed so fragile tonight, so emotional. He's stronger than he looks, Sarah said. He's been carrying the weight of that lost love for 60 years, but I think today gave him some closure, some peace. I hope so, Crawford said. He deserves that. Sarah opened the car door, then paused. Marcus, thank you for coming today, for making the effort to be better. It means a lot. Thank you for giving me the chance, Crawford replied, for not giving up on me when you easily could have. Sarah walked to her apartment, feeling lighter than she had in months. The weight she had been carrying, the pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, to always be stronger than everyone else, it was still there. But it felt more manageable now, because she understood that she didn't have to carry it alone. 6 months after the Pentagon ceremony, Sarah received a call from Henry's neighbor. Henry had passed away peacefully in his sleep, the medal from Margaret's ceremony on his bedside table, her last letter clutched in his hand. Sarah drove to West Virginia for the funeral. It was small, attended mostly by neighbors and a few fellow veterans from Henry's VFW post. But General Mackenzie was there, as was Marcus Crawford, and Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had become close to Henry in his final months. They buried Henry in the same cemetery as Margaret's parents, with a small military ceremony. Sarah presented the folded flag to Dr. Walsh, who had no other family to receive it. The rifle salute echoed across the quiet hills, a final tribute to a soldier who had served his country with honor. After the service, Sarah stood alone at Henry's grave. She thought about his life, about his love for Margaret Walsh, about the 60 years they had spent apart but never truly separated. You can be together now, Sarah whispered to the grave. No more regulations keeping you apart, no more sacrifices required, just you and her finally free. General Mackenzie approached, standing beside her in companionable silence for a moment. Morrison left something for you, the general said, handing her an envelope. Dr. Walsh found it among his effects, with instructions to give it to you after his death. Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. She opened it carefully and found a letter in Henry's shaky handwriting. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I've gone to join Margaret. I hope there's something after this life, and I hope she's waiting for me there. I want to thank you for these past months. Your visits meant more to me than you could know. You gave an old man a chance to share his stories, to talk about the woman he loved, to feel less alone in his final days. But more than that, you gave me hope. Hope that Margaret's sacrifices weren't in vain. Hope that the military is changing, becoming better, more human. You represent the future she fought for, the army she dreamed of. I'm leaving you my collection of Margaret's letters. I've already donated copies to the Army archives, but the originals are yours. I want you to have them, to read them, to understand the full story of who she was. Don't make the same mistakes we did, Sarah. Don't sacrifice your chance at happiness for a career that will go on without you. Serve with honor, yes. Give your best to the Army, yes. But don't forget to live. Don't forget to love. Don't forget to be human. Margaret would tell you the same thing if she were here. She told me as much in her last letter to me. She wanted better for you than the life she had. Be strong, be brave, but also be kind to yourself. Allow yourself to be happy. You deserve that. All my love and respect. Henry Morrison. Sarah read the letter twice, tears streaming down her face. General Mackenzie placed a hand on her shoulder. He was a good man, the general said. They both were. Good people who made hard choices. They deserved better, Sarah said. They did, but they also created something beautiful. Their love, their service, their sacrifice, it all mattered. It all meant something. Sarah folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Right next to the letter from Margaret that she still carried, two voices from the past, both urging her toward the same thing: balance, humanity, the courage to be both strong and vulnerable. Marcus Crawford approached, having given them some privacy. Sarah, I just wanted to say, if you need anything, someone to talk to or just anything, I'm here. Sarah looked at him, this man who had been so dismissive and arrogant at Margaret's funeral, who had become a friend and ally. Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot. Morrison was right, you know, Crawford said quietly. In his letter, you deserve to be happy, we all do. Sarah thought about her life, about the choices she had made, about the future that lay ahead. She was 36 years old, a decorated combat veteran, a skilled officer with a bright career ahead of her. But she was also lonely, isolated, carrying burdens that didn't need to be carried alone. I'm thinking about making some changes, Sarah said. Maybe taking some time off, visiting family I haven't seen in years, maybe even, she trailed off uncertain. Maybe even what? Crawford prompted gently. Maybe even trying to have a life outside the army, Sarah finished. A real life, relationships, hobbies, things that have nothing to do with rank or protocol. That sounds healthy, Crawford said with an encouraging smile. General Mackenzie nodded approvingly. The Army will always be here, Lieutenant, but life won't wait. Morrison and Walsh learned that too late. Don't make the same mistake. As they walked away from the cemetery, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt light, free. The weight of expectation, the burden of always having to be perfect, was lifting. Not disappearing entirely. She was still a soldier, still committed to her duty. But it was balanced now, tempered by the understanding that duty wasn't everything. Colonel Margaret Walsh had been a hero, a trailblazer, a woman who had sacrificed her personal happiness for the greater good. But she had also been human, with regrets and wishes and hopes for the people who came after her. And her greatest hope, as expressed in her final letter to Henry, was that the next generation would find a way to serve with honor while still living full, rich, human lives. Sarah Chen was determined to honor that hope, to be the officer and the person that Margaret Walsh had believed she could be, not just strong, but also kind, not just dedicated, but also balanced, not just a soldier, but also a human being who deserved love and happiness and joy. As she drove away from the cemetery with the mountains of West Virginia fatting in her rearview mirror, Sarah made herself a promise. She would live. She would serve. She would honor the sacrifices of those who came before her, but she would also allow herself to be happy, to be human, to be whole. It was what Margaret would have wanted. It was what Henry would have wanted. And finally, after all these years, it was what Sarah wanted for herself too. The story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Colonel Margaret Walsh, and Sergeant Major Henry Morrison was a story of sacrifice and service, of love and loss, of duty and redemption. But most of all, it was a story of hope, hope that each generation could learn from the mistakes of the past and build something better for the future. And as the sun set on another day, Sarah Chen drove toward that future with an open heart and the knowledge that she was not alone. She carried with her the wisdom of her mentor, the love of a man who had understood sacrifice, and the support of friends who had learned to see beyond rank and protocol to the human beings underneath. The flag that General Mackenzie had ordered be given to Henry Morrison at Margaret Walsh's funeral had been more than just a piece of fabric. It had been a symbol of recognition, of respect, of the understanding that service takes many forms and that every soldier's story matters. Now that flag, along with Margaret's letters and Henry's final words, rested in Sarah's apartment, a reminder of where she had come from and where she was going, a reminder that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that duty and happiness weren't mutually exclusive, that being human wasn't a weakness, but the greatest strength of all. And in that understanding, Sarah Chen found her peace, her purpose, and her path forward into a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow.